Now, we're still in the theoretical world of generative linguistics. We started outside generative linguistics with a pragmatic approach to meaning, where meaning was context bound, very tied to the intentions of speakers in specific situations. Then we hit meaning approached in a purely logical and abstract theoretical fashion in semantics, and we just did syntax and morphology. We're still there, but we're going to drop down one level now to the level of sound. But like meaning, what we're going to find is that sound can be approached from an abstract theoretical point of view in phonology, or from a context-bound, situation-dependent point of view in phonetics. So phonology, as it's part of this generative enterprise, is concerned with the systematic organization of particular sounds within a language. But I need to be careful about the word sound. When we speak of sound in phonology, we're not talking about noise. We're talking about an abstract unit represented symbolically called a phoneme. Now, in spoken language, in any given within any given language, it's possible to identify recurring units which correspond to phonemes, much as letters recur in writing. So English is a terrible example here because English spelling is the very, very worst in the entire world for good reason. Most languages have spelling in which the relationship between the ordering of letters and the sounds produced is regular. And in that case, a letter is much like a phoneme. The reason English spelling is such a disaster is because English was the language of the empire. It spread over the whole world, and everywhere it went, it picked up new words, new ways of saying things, with the result that English now is a hodgepodge mixture of very, very many different languages. I don't know if we should call it a language anymore. Anyway, phonology starts with the assumption that much like there are rules governing the ordering of words and the combination of morphemes into words, that there are rules governing the sequencing of sounds in a given language. So here are, for example, some words which are non-words. These are not words in English. Scraw, stlomp, fifth, and poink. But if you look at them, I encourage you to vote for them. Which of these are potentially good English words? Which of them are not good English words? Sorry, we're not doing this in class because it's more fun, but usually it goes like this. Scraw, yeah, looks reasonable. Stlomp, no way. No way, stlomp is not a good word. And that STL cluster looks like an illegal sequence of sounds, doesn't it? Fifth is not acceptable as an English word, but it's a perfectly good German word as it happens, so that you can see that the sequencing rules are language specific. Poink is an interesting one. Most people are willing to accept poink as a potential English word, but one of the criteria you might use is how similar is it to other words that are already within the language. So scraw is quite similar to straw, for example, or squaw, and it's got neighbours. Poink doesn't really have neighbours. Boink and oink are two borderline wordish things you might draw on. So poink is, to my mind anyway, not as good as scraw, but you may differ. So these rules are not necessarily all black and white. So not all illegal combinations are necessarily equally bad. So if you were taking a class on phonology, what kind of things would you do? Well, you do exercises. It's very like solving crossword puzzles. What you do is you'd look at a whole bunch of words, typically in the language, and try to figure out what are the regularities underlying them. So let's do a little example here. We know English has a plural marker. We noticed this when we compare dog and dogs. So a phonologist might ask, what are the sounds in the plural marker? Well, here's a bunch of words. Let's have a look. Lip, lips. S. S. It's an S-like sound, isn't it? Rock, rocks. It's an S-like sound. So it looks like the sound of the plural in English is S. an S-like sound. Tree, trees. Oh, that's different. Trees. It's a Z-like sound. Zzz, a buzzing. So now we've got two plural markers. Rocks, trees. So z. Latch, latches. That's a third one. Uz. It gets a whole extra syllable. Trees and rocks didn't increase the number of syllables, but latches does. So now we've got s, z, and uz. Heavens. And we can go through the rest of the words here. I'm sure you're quite capable of doing this. And what we find is that there's only three. So how do you know which one to use? So perhaps when you learn a word, you also learn the plural marker, and so forever those are associated. But I can demonstrate clearly that that's not the case. I just introduced you to the new word scrawl. Has as yet no meaning. This is a scrawl. So what's the plural of scrawl? You're in no doubt, are you? It's scraws. Uz. It's the Z one. It's not scraws, and it's not scross. It's scraws. So this demonstrates clearly that you know that you use the regularities underlying the distribution of these three forms in forming plurals. You don't learn each one individually, but rather you have internalized the rule, as it were. Now, how do you know which one to use? That's the kind of game you would play then in your phonology class. You would look at the sounds and you would try to figure out, is there some kind of factor which determines which one to use? There is, of course. A full answer to that kind of question would refer to the final sound before the plural marker, so the p in lips, the k in rocks, the vowel e in trees, the complicated ch sound in latches, and it would have to consider whether that sound is, as we say, voiced or voiceless, and is it simple or complex? We don't need to get into the details here, but this is the kind of puzzle solving that goes on in phonology. It's an attempt to uncover the regularities underlying the distribution of abstract phonemes. Here's another example. We won't spend long on this, but in Ireland, we pronounce some of these words differently than they do in New York. In fact, new, as in New York, is one of the words that we pronounce differently. So we say new, and if you go to New York, they say New York. Not new, but new. New. And some of these words are pronounced the same in New York, and some of them are pronounced differently. So if you go to New York, they say pure, like us. They say cute. But here comes one. Tune in Ireland is a tune in New York. Strange, isn't it? How do they know which ones to pronounce differently? Abuse is abuse in New York, but dues is dues in New York. Heavens, some of these seem to be different. So which ones are subject to variation? And is it a regular process? Is there something about the preceding sounds that would tell you whether the vowel is going to be u or oo? And we're not going to dig into it too much. The answer turned out to be complicated, but it is regular. The consonant preceding the vowel is the conditioning factor. That's what matters. If it's produced just behind the teeth at the alveolar ridge, as many sounds are, like n, t, d, then the sound varies on each side. So New York and New York, that n sound is produced at the alveolar ridge. There are sounds that we produce forward of the alveolar ridge, like p sounds, pure, and there are sounds we produce behind this, like g. In those cases, it doesn't vary between Ireland and New York, but if it's produced precisely at the alveolar ridge, it varies. Who knew? Phonology is concerned with these kinds of abstract problems. The abstract entities it deals with are phonemes, which are hypothetical sound atoms specific to a given language. And these are the units from which then morphemes will be built in language-specific ways. And we assume that because the view of generative linguistics is to view an entity called French or English as a system, the rules pertain to the system called English or the system called Italian. Semantics, syntax, morphology, and phonology are all in this game together. They all take this approach to language. Notice that in our discussion of semantics, syntax, morphology, and phonology, it didn't matter whether we were dealing with written or spoken language. Phonemes find representation on the page just as well as they do in sounds, even though the idea refers to an abstract sound. So that's the generative core. We're now going to drop out and we're going to come at sound again, but this time, just like with pragmatics and semantics, phonology is within the generative core and phonetics is outside it. Phonetics is concerned with the spoken word, with speech as a modality. It has nothing to do with writing. It's concerned with the production and the perception of speech. So it's concerned with bodies, with lungs, with spit, with meat, with flapping lips. Speech is, of course, an extremely important modality in which language finds expression. One could argue it is the principal modality through which language finds expression. So when we get to phonetics, we've changed the game here. We're dealing with physical sounds that you can record with a microphone. We're not treating them as abstract symbolic entities. So something which might be written, p, irrespective of where it occurs, might be produced very differently. So the P sound at the start of the word pan is very different from the P sound at the end of the word tap. If we were to record them and look at the signal, we would see they were very, very different. So don't confuse phonetics and phonology. Phonology, they both deal with sound in language, but phonology deals with these idealized symbolic units combined according to formal rules with a view that there is a system called Italian, French, English, Yoruba, whatever. Phonetics deals with real sound, meat, spit, ears, the physical world. Both try to understand how language is made manifest in speech to some extent. Phonology doesn't care too much, though, about whether it's spoken or written. Here's an example of the kind of data that phoneticians love. Here's some real-time MRI of a vocal tract while speaking. This is what's going on inside your mouth when you speak.
Welcome to the Science Gallery of the Max Planck Society.
Remarkable. We've only recently acquired the ability to make images like this. These are not X-ray images, but MRI images. We'll be meeting MRI later in the course. So phonetics is the production and perception of speech in its physical manifestation. Phoneticians care greatly about anatomy and physiology of speaking and hearing. So it's a very, very empirical science. The main topics it's concerned with are the production, transmission, and perception of speech. Phonology is the systematic organization of a discrete set of linguistic units, of phonemes, within a language, and it assumes the existence of rules and tries to uncover these rules. So it's discovering systematic regularities in these sequencing. That's a theoretical enterprise. One could argue there is no system, or one could assume that there is a system. And so this completes our tour of generative linguistics. And there I've shown the 6 disciplines we looked at. And you can see pragmatics and phonetics are outside of this box, whereas semantics, syntax, morphology, and phonology are all inside. And at the top, we have 2 disciplines associated with meaning, pragmatics and semantics. At the bottom, we have 2 disciplines associated with sound, phonology and phonetics. And so you can see now that the concerns of generative linguistics are bounded. They adopt a specific stance with respect to something called language, and that there's an awful lot more to explore. And we'll move on to explore some other aspects in the next video.